So we will read and annotate Desiree's Baby by Kate Chopin. As the day was pleasant, Madame Valmande drove over to La Abri to see Desiree and the baby. It made her laugh to think of Desiree with the baby. I had seen but yesterday that Desiree was little more than a baby herself, when Monsieur, in riding through the gateway of Valmande, had found her lying asleep in the shadow of the big stone pillar. The little one awoke in his arms and began to cry for Dada. This that was as much as she could do or say. Some people thought she might have strayed there from her own accord, for she was the toddling age. The prevailing belief was that she had been purposely left by a party of Texans whose canvas covered wagon late in the day had crossed the ferry that Caton Mace kept just below the plantation. In time, Madame Valmande abandoned every speculation but the one that Desiree had been sent to her by a beneficent providence to be the child of her affection, seeing that she was without child of the flesh, for the girl grew to be beautiful and gentle, affectionate and sincere, the idol of Valmande. It was no wonder when she stood one day against a stone pillar in whose shadow she had lain asleep 18 years before, that Armand Aubigny, riding by and seeing her there, had fallen in love with her. That was the way all the Aubignys fell in love, as if struck by a pistol shot. The wonder was that he had not loved her before, for he had known her since his father brought him home from Paris, a boy of 8, after his mother died there. The passion that awoke him in that day, when he saw her at the gate, swept along like an avalanche, or like a prairie fire, or like anything that drives headlong over all obstacles. Monsieur Valmande grew practical and wanted things well considered. That is the girl's obscure origin. Armand looked into her eyes and did not care. He was reminded that she was nameless. What did it matter about a name when he could give her one of the oldest and proudest in Louisiana? He ordered the corbeille from Paris and contained himself with what patience he could until it arrived. Then they were married. All right, so we will call this the exposition. It lays out everything we need to know. We got our setting. We're in this La Brie plantation, also known as a forced labor camp. Plantation can give this romanticized setting, which wouldn't be what we want to do here, right? So then we have Madame Valmande, and she's going to see her adopted daughter Desiree. Now, obviously, this would have been the late 1800s, so like adoption type bureaucracy wasn't as official nowadays. And this could be a good way if we didn't notice the setting or if we couldn't get the time period. A situation like this doesn't occur in modern day, where a kid just shows up and then it's like yours, and like government doesn't really have anything to say about it. All right, so all of this exposition also meeting Armand and him falling in love with Desiree. Now we are third person narration under the point of view of um, Madame Valmande as she's pulling up to visit her daughter Desiree. And then this part here, Monsieur, that would be French for Mr. Valmande, grew practical and wanted all things considered. That is the girl's obscure origin. So what this means is that before Desiree and Armand got married, the Desiree's dad was like, listen, you do know that we don't know her family because we're in Louisiana and heritage would have been very important. The old name, the respectable family, all of these things is what Kate Chopin is touching on. All right, moving into our rising action. Madame Valmande had not seen Desiree and the baby for 4 weeks. When she reached La Abri, she shuddered at the first sight of it, as she always did. It was a sad-looking place, which for many years had not known the gentle presence of a mistress. Old Monsieur Aubigny having married and buried his wife in France, and she having loved her own land too well to ever leave it, the roof came down steep and black like a cowl, reaching out beyond the wide galleries that encircled the yellow stuccoed house. Big solemn oaks grew close to it, and their thick-leaved, far-reaching branches shadowed it like a pall. Young Aubigny's rule was a strict one, too, and under it his had forgotten to be gay, as they had been during the old master's easy-going and indulgent lifetime. The young mother was recovering slowly and lay full length in her soft white muslins and laces upon a couch. The baby was beside her, upon her arm, where he had fallen asleep at her breast. The yellow nurse woman sat beside a window fanning herself. Madame Valmande bent her portly figure over Desiree and kissed her, holding her an instant tenderly in her arms. Then she turned to the child. "This is not the baby," she exclaimed in startled tones. French was the language spoken at Vimaldi in those days. "I knew you would be astonished, Desiree, at the way he has grown, the little cochon de lad. Look at his legs, mamma, and his hands and fingernails, real fingernails. Zandrine had to cut them this morning. Isn't it true, Zandrine?" The woman bowed her turbaned head majestically. "Merci, madame." "And the way he cries," went on Desiree, "is deafening. Armand all the heard him the other day as far away as Leblanc's cabin." This is foreshadowing. Now, Madame Valmont had never removed her eyes from the child. She lifted and walked over with it to the window that was lightest. She scanned the baby narrowly, then looked as searchingly at Zandrine, whose face was turned across the fields. All of this is foreshadowing. "Yes, the child had grown, has changed," said Madame Valmont slowly, as she replaced it beside its mother. "What does Armand say?" Desiree's face became suffused with a glow that was happiness itself. "Oh, Armand is the proudest father in the parish, I believe chiefly because it is a boy to bear his name. Though he says not, that he would have loved a girl as well. But I know it isn't true. I know he says that to please me. And mamma," she added, drawing Madame Valmont's head down to her, and speaking in a whisper, "he hasn't punished one of them, not one of them, since baby is born. Even the Grillon, who pretended to have burned his leg that he might rest from work, he only laughed, and said the Grillon was a great scamp. Oh, mamma, I'm so happy it frightens me." What Desiree said was true. Marriage and later the birth of his son had softened Armand Aubigny's imperious and exacting nature greatly. This was what made the gentle Desiree so happy, for she loved him desperately. When he frowned, she trembled, but loved him. When he smiled, she asked no greater blessing of God. But Armand's dark, handsome face had not often been disfigured by frowns since the day he fell in love with her. When the baby was about 3 months old, Desiree awoke one day to the conviction that there was something. Oops, I want to move this one. It won't let me. Ah, darn. There was something in the air menacing her peace. It was at first too subtle to grasp. It had only been a disquieting suggestion, an air of mystery among the blacks, unexpected visits from far off neighbors who could hardly account for their coming. Then a strange and awful change in her husband's manner, which she dared not ask him to explain. When he spoke to her, it was with averted eyes, from which the old love light seemed to have gone out. He absented himself from home, and when there, avoided her presence and that of her child without excuse, and the very spirit of Satan seemed suddenly to take hold of him in his dealings with the slaves. Desiree was miserable enough to die. She sat in her room one hot afternoon in her peignoir, listlessly drawing through her fingers the strands of her long silky brown hair that hung above her shoulders. The baby, half naked, lay asleep upon her own great mahogany bed that was like a sumptuous throne with its satin-lined half canopy. One of Leblanc's little quadroon boys, half naked too, stood fanning the child slowly with a fan of peacock feathers. Desiree's eyes had fixed absently and sadly upon the baby while she was striving to penetrate the threatening mist that felt closing about her. She looked from her child to the boy who sat beside him, and back again, and over and over. Ah, it was a cried that could not help, which she was not conscious of having uttered. The blood turned like ice in her veins, and a clammy moisture gathered upon her face. She tried to speak to the little quadroon boy, but no sound would come at first. When he heard his name uttered, he looked up, and his mistress was pointing to the door. He laid aside the great fan, soft and obediently stole away, and over the polished floor on his bare tiptoes. You could say this part here. All right, so this page is important because we have this foreshadowing. Zandrine would be a slave in this house, a slave. She's forced to be there. She's not a paid nanny, okay? And when the mom starts to look at the baby and at Zandrine, who would have been a lighter, it's possible Zandrine could be the child of a slave owner, maybe Armand's dad. So technically, Xandrine could be Armand's half sister. That could be implied, but Armand's dad, they do. Chopin tries to paint him out as a decent, a somewhat, however decent you could be. But he lived in France, where slavery was not allowed, or slavery had been abolished in France. So if he was living in France, he wouldn't have technically owned slaves while he was there, but it appears the plantation remained under other ownership. I'm not sure. All right. So now this is when the mom notices that the baby has dark features. And then we have, that's why she's looking at Xandrine, because Xandrine would have dark features as well, biracial. Now we have Desiree. This is characterization. Desiree is obviously very dependent on Armand, helpless, dependent, um, almost manipulated, and you could characterize Armand as abusive. Um, I want to say protective, a provider, but that's easy for him to do because he's already providing for himself. So Desiree just being there. All right, now when we go down, this is when she has an epiphany. An epiphany is when a character makes a dramatic realization. Her looking back over and over, uttering the cry, ah, that's Desiree's epiphany. Now, here we could say we're getting into our climax. All right. So, Armand, she called to him, a voice which must have stabbed him if he were human, but he didn't notice. Armand, she said again. Then she rose and tottered towards him. Armand, she panted once more, clutching his arm. Look at our child. What does it mean? Tell me. He coldly but gently loosened her fingers from about his arm and thrust the hand away from him. Tell me what it means, she cried despairingly. It means, he answered lightly, that the child is not white. It means that you are not white. A quick conception of all this accusation meant for her nerved her with unwanted courage to deny it. It is a lie. It is not true. I am white. Look at my hair. It is brown, and my eyes are gray. Armand, you know they are gray, and my skin is fair. Seizing his wrist. Look at my hand, wetter than yours, Armand. She laughed hysterically. As white as LeBlanc's, he returned cruelly and went away, leaving her alone with their child. When she could hold a pen in hand, she sent a despairing letter to Madame Valmont. My mother, they tell me I am not white. Armand has told me I am not white. For God's sake, tell them this is not true. You must know it is not true. I shall die. I must die. I cannot be so unhappy and live. The answer that came was brief. My own Desiree, come home to Valmont. Back to your mother who loves you. Come with your child. When the letter reached Desiree, she went with it to her husband's study and laid it open upon the desk before which she had sat. She was like a stone image, silent, white, motionless, after she placed it there. In silence, he ran his cold eyes over the written words. He said nothing. Shall I go, Armand? She asked, in tones sharp with agonized suspense. Yes, go. Do you want me to go? Yes, I want you to go. He thought Almighty God had dealt cruelly and unjustly with him, and felt somehow that he was paying him back in kind when he stabbed thus into his wife's soul. Moreover, he no longer loved her because of the unconscious injury she had brought upon his home and his name. She turned away like one stunned by a blow, and walked slowly towards the door, hoping he would call her back. This would be your climax. No point of return. And unwanted would mean when she says unwanted courage, it would mean suddenly brought on, unusual. So this can tell us that she normally doesn't snap at Armand in this way. She just agrees with everything he says. So this would be our climax of the story. Now, resolution or falling action and resolution. Let's see. This would be your this would be falling action. This resolution. Goodbye, Armand, she moaned. He did not answer her. That was his last blow at fate. Desiree went in search of her child. Xandrine was pacing the somber gallery with it. She took the little one from the nurse's arms with no words of explanation and descending the steps walked away under the live oak branches. It was an October afternoon. The sun was just sinking. Out in the still fields, the black slaves were picking cotton. Desiree had not changed a thin white garment, nor the slippers which she wore. Her hair was uncovered, and the sun's rays brought a golden gleam from its brown meshes. She did not take the broad beaten road which led to the far off plantation of Valmonde. She walked across a deserted field where the stubble bruised her tender feet so delicately shod, and tore her thin gown to shreds. She disappeared among the reeds and willows that grew thick among the banks of the deep, sluggish bayou, and she did not come back again. A bayou is a swamp, and Desiree would have killed herself and her baby, which is very sad. Some weeks later, there was a curious scene enacted at L'Abri. In the center of the smoothly swept backyard was a great bonfire. Armand of Bigny sat in the wide hallway that commanded a view of the spectacle, and it was he who dealt out to half a dozen slaves the material which kept his fire ablaze. A graceful cradle of willow, with all of its dainty furbishings, was laid upon the pyre, which had already been fed with the richness of a priceless layette. Then there were silk gowns and velvet and satin ones added to these, laces too, the embroideries, bonnets, and gloves, for the corbeille had been of rare quality. The last thing to go was a tiny bundle of letters, innocent little scribblings that Desiree had sent to him during the days of their espousal engagement. There was the remnant of one back in the drawer from which he took them, but it was not Desiree's. It was part of an old letter from his mother to his father, and he read it. She was thanking God for the blessings of her husband's love, but above all, she wrote, night and day, I thank the good God for having so arranged our lives that our dear Armand will never know that his mother, who adores him, belongs to the race that is cursed with the brand of slavery. So the resolution would be the irony that Armand had told his wife to leave, basically threw her out of the house with their son, causing her to kill herself. And then now Armand finds out that the person who is biracial between him and Desiree is him. So the reason his son had biracial features was because he was half black. His mother was black. So, and this would also explain this irony. It could show you how it was an example of foreshadowing that Armand never knew his mother. Because, like I said, if they had chose to live in France, it was because they could live out their lives as a normal couple. I mean, they would have faced like racism, but it wouldn't have been outright against the law for Armand's white father to be married to a black woman. That wouldn't have been against the law in France. So that is our story, and we'll identify our literary elements in the next lessons.